all have a connection to U of T, but I'm Michael Hain. I'm now the Program Manager of Transportation Planning Policy and Analysis at the City of Toronto. I finished my M.A.Sc here in 2010. And Lily, you want to go next?
Yeah. Hi everyone, I'm B.A.Sc. I'm the Transportation Planner at the City of Toronto. I did my bachelor's and master's here at this lab. Graduated in 2019. It's nice to be back here.
I'm Megan. I have a little bit of a different background. I also went to UT, but I finished my Ph.D. in physiology, actually, in neuroscience, this past summer. And then I joined the city through the Urban Fellows program, which recruits people recently finished a graduate degree, basically. And for my first rotation, it's a 12-month program with 2 6-month rotations, and my first one was in my first group working in transportation planning. So that's why I'm here.
So, superficially, we're here to talk about the review of the parking requirements in the zoning bylaw that we've been working on since 2021. But we're also happy to talk about what it's like working for the City of Toronto. And ideally, you all leave here really keen to work for us one day. But with that, I'll get into it. So to give a bit of a background for the sort of work we do, although Glenn and I both came from an engineering background, we're now in the City Planning Division at the City of Toronto, which is much more focused on policy and development related things as opposed to engineering, designy sorts of things. And there's a bit of a gap, at least in my experience at UofT, in getting background on how policy development works. So I wanted to start out giving you a bit of a sense of that. Policy change really depends on timing. And if you look at the literature, there's this concept of multiple streams framework, where you have 3 different groups of actors. The problem stream, which are really people facing problems that may benefit from government action. The policy stream, these are stakeholders, sometimes government employees, sometimes NGOs or other sorts of advocacy groups, looking at how to develop policy, and the political stream. So in our case, city councilors, but at provincial level MPPs or the federal level MPs. And to make policy change happen, all of these groups need to realize that there is a space where there's a problem that's salient, urgent, and solvable for change to actually happen. And when that happens and they all come together, it's called a policy window. And it's generally a pretty brief opportunity in time where you can create change and work together to develop a policy that could be implemented. As I'll talk about later, our work on the parking review really benefited from one of those policy windows opening. As we work in city planning, we are governed by the provincial planning framework, and that's mostly identified in the Planning Act. But what the Planning Act does, among other things, is identify a requirement for every municipality in the province to have an official plan. And the official plan describes how the land in each municipality will be used. In our case, it often includes other policies related to actions that the city will take in order to support that land development. But it's primarily there to identify the physical evolution of the city over time. So things like where new housing is, where employment can be located, infrastructure services like roads, sewers, water mains, sometimes timing, but usually not timing, and other sorts of community improvements like community centers or other sorts of amenities like that. As I said, it's required by the Planning Act, but it's a document that's adopted by each city council and approved by the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing. The policies in the official plan tend to be more stable than other policy documents at a city because there is a regulated process that you have to go through to change an official plan. It's not that council is in any way bound to the policies in the official plan. They're able to change them. It's just that the process to change it is long enough and awkward enough that there's just a built-in discouragement to making a lot of change. When council is adopting an official plan, it has to be consistent with the planning framework that the province has set, which really means complying with the growth plan, the provincial policy statement, and other, I guess those are the 2 that you have to comply with, but there are other policies that you generally try to align with in order to maintain good relationships between different levels of government. The official plan fits into a broader planning framework at the City of Toronto, where all of the policies kind of fit together, starting out with the council vision at the top, which gets further articulated in the corporate strategic plan, and then the official plan, which, as I said earlier, lays out the policies related to the fiscal form of the city. The official plan is further enacted with different sorts of policy documents or guidelines, one of which is the zoning bylaw that we'll talk about through the rest of the presentation. And then each of those guidelines, policies, and standards and things are really put into force through annual budget process. In the case of our official plan, from a parking perspective, we have a lot of policies in there that talk about what we're trying to do with parking. But ultimately, they mostly come to an objective of trying to reduce the amount of driving that people do and encourage people to walk, cycle, or take transit instead. There are a lot of reasons for that. The biggest ones being it's just more efficient. We can get more people moved by our transportation system if there are fewer people in cars. And more recently, there's the climate impact of people using internal combustion engine vehicles instead of electric vehicles or just more sustainable modes. So getting into the first part of the zoning bylaw review that we did, focused on automobile parking. This work finished in 2021, and we made a number of policy changes, or a number of regulatory changes in the zoning bylaw. The zoning bylaw that we were reviewing was adopted in 2013, but the parking components of it were developed based on studies that had been done between 2005 and 2007. So the parking framework that was in the zoning bylaw was quite out of date and didn't line up with just emerging best practices. But ultimately, some of the changes that we did were that we removed most of the parking minimums in the zoning bylaw. We did maintain a couple of minimums, a very low level of visitor parking, and also requirements for accessible parking for people that just have mobility challenges. We also introduced parking maximums. The zoning bylaw already had a number of maximums, but we introduced maximums where they didn't already exist for almost all land uses. We also introduced requirements for bicycle parking maintenance facilities and electric vehicle charging equipment. And one of the complications, as you'll hear from Megan, is that our former accessible parking requirements were based on the parking minimums. So when we removed those minimums, we had to reimagine how the accessible parking requirements could be maintained. We argued for this change in policy based on a multi-factor approach, and I'll talk about the different factors now. The first is that we wanted to bring more of a market mechanism to the supply of parking. That if you have a parking minimum, you often end up with more parking being built than is really demanded. And in that case, people that aren't using parking or don't want to purchase parking will end up subsidizing people that do want to purchase parking, because the developer is not going to develop unless they make their particular rate of return on a project. So they will balance around where they're getting revenues in the project to make that work out. If they can't get as much revenue on parking as they need to pay for it, they'll get the revenue from somewhere else. So we're trying to bring in this market mechanism where only the amount of parking that's actually demanded will be provided. And as a result, the price of the parking should reflect the market rate. Eliminating parking minimums lines up with the emerging direction in the world. We weren't the first city to remove parking minimums. We were really copying from the city of Edmonton, but the city of London in the UK, San Francisco, Berlin, Mexico City, Buffalo, and many other cities had already removed parking minimums when we were doing our work, and many cities have removed them since we did our work. Housing affordability was an emerging issue at the time. It's become even more of an issue now. But removing parking minimums can lead to more cost-effective forms of development. If developers aren't forced to build parking that isn't required, then they can lower costs on the actual housing component of their projects, or projects that weren't previously viable can become viable because the costs on them are lower. Also, removing minimums will streamline the development review process. Prior to us removing parking minimums, a about 80% of mixed-use developments, which includes most condo buildings or most development that happens in the city, were being approved with less parking than what our zoning bylaw required. So we already had a recognition at the city that our bylaw required too much parking. Removing the minimums is effectively recognizing that and just making it easier for developers to provide the amount of parking that they already wanted to provide. Construction of parking, because it's typically below grade, is among the most disruptive parts of the construction process. So removing or reducing the amount of parking that's being provided can accelerate construction and bring more housing online faster. The plot on the screen is of the proportion of households without a car for different income levels. So you can see that generally higher income households are more likely to have a car than lower income households. So these sorts of changes also represent an equity improvement, that households that don't have a car won't be forced to subsidize the generally higher income households that do have cars. There's also recognition at the city that the climate emergency that we're facing. The transportation sector accounts for about a third of emissions in Toronto. So any sort of measure that we can implement that reduces the desirability of driving would be a good thing. Over-construction of parking makes driving more attractive. Having easily available parking just makes it easier to drive. So reducing this amount of parking is in line with our climate objectives. Another point that we were trying to make with council is that traffic congestion is bad. The city is expected to grow significantly over the next few decades, and that congestion is only going to get worse unless we can encourage people to use more space-efficient forms of travel. So really anything other than a personal vehicle is better than a personal vehicle. The plot on the screen now is the mode share by car of people going to work or school. Although this isn't the majority of travel in the city, it's the easiest to track, and it's the most consistent over time. There is already a decline in the auto mode share, both in the downtown in the light gray and the rest of the city in the dark blue. So further encouraging this trend, making parking more market-driven would be very helpful. Having said that, we recognize with the requirements for accessible parking that there will always be trips that are not well served by non-auto modes or not as easily served by non-auto modes. So what we're doing with the change is not preventing people from building parking, but trying to rationalize or balance the amount of parking that's actually being provided so that it meets the essential needs of people. During our consultations, we had a lot of concerns around on-street parking. In older parts of the city, on-street parking is the predominant form of parking available, and there are generally concerns anytime development is coming near those areas that the demand for parking from those new developments will crowd out existing people from the area. To try and mitigate or reassure folks that that won't happen, through the process we standardized the approach of prohibiting occupants of new development from getting access to those on-street parking permits. So maintaining that on-street parking for the people that were already used to it. You could argue whether or not that's actually equitable, but it was an approach that made the policy acceptable to council. So getting back to that idea that I mentioned earlier about policy windows, we were only directed to do the review I believe it was January of 2021, and we got council to adopt the new standards in December of 2021. So effectively 11 months. Well, I guess you probably haven't worked for the city, but 11 months in the scale of time for the city is extremely fast to do anything. And really, to get big change like this done, it's often easier to do it fast than slow. So the change was adopted by the council in December. It was actually enacted in February, and a later piece was enacted in July. So it's now all in force. I don't want to get too into the weeds on how transition to a new policy happens, but if you're interested in that, we can talk about it later. But ultimately, the policy change was quite successful. The politics, the policymakers, and the the public got together, realized that there was a good time for a change, and we made that change happen. Going forward, we're monitoring the effects of this change. One of the fantastic things about the city, fantastic in a sarcastic way, is that we know surprisingly little about what goes on in the city. With most projects, one of the biggest challenges is finding data to support any sort of meaningful analysis. To try and make this easier for future updates, we've adopted this monitoring program where we're actively tracking how much parking is being proposed and then ultimately provided in new developments. And we're also working with a broader piece of work in the city on a citywide parking strategy to develop a better parking inventory so that we actually know how much parking is out there and can adjust the amount of the supply to meet the demands going forward. So that covers the auto parking piece, and I'll pass it to Luna to talk about the bike parking piece.
Thank you, Michael. Hi everyone. I'm going to share with you the work we have done for the zoning bylaw bicycle parking standards. As Michael mentioned, the initial phase of this project concluded in December 2021, where the Planning and Housing Committee adopted the following amendments with regard to bicycle parking. So first, the short-term residential bicycle parking rate in Bicycle Zone 1 was increased from 0.1 space per dwelling unit to 0.2 space per dwelling unit. And meanwhile, a payment in lieu program was implemented so that up to 50% of the short-term residential bicycle parking requirements can be satisfied by providing a payment in lieu to the city. And that reserve fund is intended for improving cities' bike share system. There's also new requirements for the bicycle parking maintenance facilities for any building with 5 or more long-term bicycle parking spaces. At the same time, city staff were directed to continue work on the review of bicycle parking standards in the zoning bylaw and the city's guidelines for the design and management of bicycle parking facilities. So here's the objectives of this work. Building on these objectives with an emphasis on encouraging transportation alternatives to automobiles, we proposed the following guiding principles for the bicycle parking review work, which is that bicycle parking zoning standards should require sufficient parking to encourage people of all ages, abilities, and means to bicycles for their everyday transportation, recreation, and commercial activity. Our methodology was first to review all the existing regulations and guidelines in Toronto for bicycle parking, which includes the following items listed here. As indicated in the brackets, the zoning bylaw and the Toronto's guidelines both came into effect many years ago, which are due for a review to be better aligned with the increasing demand of bicycle parking and the growing interest in housing affordability and travel behavior. At the same time, our team also did a jurisdictional scan of bicycle parking standards in other North America cities, as shown here. When comparing Toronto's standards with these cities, we try to identify any gap that could be potentially closed to make bicycle parking in Toronto easier and more accessible for everyone. We want our standards to be in line with the most bicycle-friendly large cities in North America with the changes that we are going to propose to the zoning bylaw. Based on the findings of this review, we believe a list of changes could be proposed and made to the zoning bylaw in relation to 6 aspects of bicycle parking. First, the location, like where the bicycle parking should be located inside and outside the building. Access, how convenient and accessible for the users to reach the bicycle parking areas. The clearance, like how much space the cyclist will have within the bicycle parking area to move around. The dimensions of each bicycle parking space to ensure that the bikes can be security locked and fit into the bicycle parking area properly, And we have considered all bike rack styles, from the standard horizontal ones to the angled ones to vertical stack and even the bike lockers. We also reviewed the requirements of shower and change facilities in order to improve the user experience at the end of their trips. And last but not the least, the parking rates. We are going to update the parking rates in the zoning bylaw to be more in line with the bicycle parking friendly cities in North America to ensure sufficient spaces are provided at the new and enlarged developments. So here are some of the changes we are considering to propose to the zoning bylaw. First, to ensure bicycle parking is convenient, accessible, and safe for all users, we would like to improve the proximity of short-term bicycle parking to the building entrance and to introduce a bicycle-friendly path of travel for users to reach indoor bicycle parking area from the street level. And we would also like to restrict the use of stacked or vertical racks to be no more than half of the long-term bicycle parking spaces. We are also considering about adding minimum hour width requirements and reserving a proportion of long-term parking spaces for the oversized or extra large bikes so that people have adequate space to move and lock their bicycles. Also, to promote cycling for everyday activities, we would like to provide cyclists with better experience at the end of their trips. To do that, we would like to update the requirements of shower and change facilities. We are also going to update the bicycle parking rates in the zoning bylaw. As I mentioned previously, it's due for review for a long time, and we want to make sure there's sufficient space to be provided at new developments so that Toronto has a bicycle-friendly environment for all users. And this could include an expansion of the payment in lieu program, as well as an increase of parking rates at the residential or non-residential buildings. So during our public consultation in November, we also launched a public survey online and posted on multiple platforms for advertisement. In the survey, we asked questions about their travel behaviors, like the ownership of vehicles and bikes, as well as the frequency of cycling. And we also asked questions about bicycle parking experience and the factors affecting people's decision on using a bicycle. In total, we got 194 respondents in a month and a half, and 82% of these respondents reached the end of this survey. Due to the nature of this survey, we can see that most of the respondents are active cyclists who cycle every day or at least a few times a week. In terms of the demographics, about 80% of the respondents live in Bicycle Zone 1, which is the area bounded by Humber River to the west, Lawrence Avenue to the north, and Victoria Park to the east. On average, we see there are 2.4 persons in each household. This number is quite similar to what we saw from the census data for Toronto. And the graph here shows the household income distribution. As we can see, it might not be representative for the general population, since 67% of the respondents have a household income of $110,000 or more before tax. So the most important question we asked in this survey is how bicycle parking factors affect the people's decision on using a bicycle. So we asked the respondents to choose between a scale of 1 to 5 for each of the following factors. And here's the summary of the results, which is ranked from the most important to the least important. But just to be clear, the least important does not mean it's not important. In fact, rarely any respondents choose the score of 1, which means not important at all, for any of the factors here. It is just a comparison between the factors so that we can prioritize the requirements and help the developers to allocate the budget more efficiently. So the factors we have considered include first the security, if the bikes are safely secured, locked to the rocks, will they be stolen by others, and the availability of bicycle parking both at home and at their destinations. Another factor is whether the bike rack is easy to use and reliable, and the access to bicycle parking areas and the cost of bicycle parking areas, and as well as the safety. Those three factors are results show the importance are very close to each other, like they have similar scores with each other. And another factor we considered is the space in the bicycle parking area and the maintenance and shower and change facilities. So overall, based on the results of the survey, we believe that for bicycle parking improvement in Toronto, quality is the most important thing we need to consider. Ideally, we would like to have secure, dedicated, access-controlled bicycle parking room for all bicycle parking. And they should be equipped with easy-to-use and high-quality bike racks. There should also be a safe and accessible seamless path from either street level to the bicycle parking area or from the bicycle parking area to people's final destinations. And we also need to plan for the increasing demand of oversized and extra large bikes to ensure they can be securely locked and move or fit in the parking area. So undoubtedly, all these changes will incur extra cost for the developers. So to balance between the cost and benefits, we are also considering the following trade-offs to have a better budget control. For example, we are considering to lower the requirements of shower or maintenance facilities. Not to say that we want to cut the maintenance facilities, but maybe considering to reduce the size requirement, but keep the function as the same as now. Now I'm going to pass it to Megan for the accessible parking. If you have any questions about the bicycle parking, we can discuss it afterward.
Thank you, Minna. All right, so I'll talk about the accessible component of this zoning bylaw review. So switching back to cars for a little bit. So as you've probably heard a couple of times at this point, we have been generally undergoing some parking-related, both vehicle and bicycle parking-related updates to the zoning bylaw. As Michael mentioned in the first bit of the presentation, most minimum parking requirements were removed in the zoning bylaw update that occurred in 2021, but we maintained minimum requirements for accessible and visitor parking. Because what we didn't want to happen is people to stop providing parking at all, and for people who might have increased automobility dependence because of various mobility needs or concerns, we wanted them to still be able to access their destination and park there if they require any accessibility needs. So we're currently kind of transitioning that update into something that better meets the needs of the population, let's say. In terms of how we're going about this, as Michael mentioned as well, getting data around things in the city can be a little bit challenging, and when it comes to parking, this is no exception. The parking monitoring program is doing a really good job of compiling and putting together a lot of that data in a very readable format. But for us, it was challenging to go one step further and even look at accessible parking because we don't necessarily track that. So a lot of this work has been relying on listening to people and understanding what their experiences are with parking to understand how we can better meet the needs of the community. So we did what we could in terms of collecting, let's say, data that was kind of pseudo-relevant to accessible parking, like infractions, population-based data, et cetera, and integrated that into the review to see what direction we should be taking. We also did community consultations for the bike parking as well, and some surveys, as well as consulting with interested parties. We also did a jurisdictional scan to understand how other places, both in Canada but also around the world, approach accessible parking requirements to understand, what do those look like? How many do they require to be installed? What do those dimensions look like? And again, is it meeting people's needs? And because accessibility is governed by a couple of different guidelines and regulations, there was also a lot of looking into those documents and understanding what is the purpose of those regulations and how can we make sure that whatever updates we make to the zoning bylaw are actually meeting or exceeding those regulations and guidelines. So some of the most frequently cited ones were the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or the AODA, which is a provincial document that mandates a number of different things, including accessible built environment design guidelines. There's also the Canadian Standards Association Built Environment Guidelines, which is a more recently updated document. It doesn't necessarily have any legislative weight, let's say, but it's a document that was put together in consultation with the community that is kind of a bit of a best practices kind of document, as well as the Toronto Accessibility Design Guidelines, which is the most recent document that we have to refer to. So to kind of guide the rest of the talk, these are some of the issues that were in scope for accessible parking review. So same thing with the bikes, the minimum rate formula. So when a developer proposes a project, how many of their parking spaces have to be accessible, and how do they actually calculate what that number looks like? The distribution of those spaces. So as we see a lot of multi-use buildings going up, that might have, let's say, a retail component as well as a residential or a visitor parking component. How do we distribute or make sure that those spaces are distributed equitably across those different parking space uses? Because what we don't want is for people to put all of the parking, let's say in residential parking, and then somebody who's visiting that area to go to the store doesn't have a place to park, for example. The dimensions of the spaces. So this is something that has been a little bit challenging because the AODA requirements actually mandate there to be two different types of parking spaces that are designated for accessible parking permit holders. There's a larger width space, which is meant primarily for van users, and then a narrower width space, which is meant for people who just need access to a place that's closer to the door, or who need that extra room from an access aisle, but don't necessarily need the extra width for an accessible vehicle, for example. So how do we make sure that the dimensions are kind of meeting the needs of those users? And finally, something that we've discovered is perhaps lacking in terms of the way that we've been regulating that is the access aisle location and dimensions of those access aisles. This is really important, as we're going to talk about a little bit later in the survey, but people have cited that having a well-placed access aisle that's an unoccupied access aisle and free of debris is one of the most important factors for a person's ability to use a space, because it really facilitates somebody opening the door all the way, for example, and getting in and out of their car, or being able to deploy a ramp. So what we've seen across the city generally is that a lot of these parking spaces, while they might be larger width, don't necessarily have an access aisle. So how can we encourage people to install an access aisle as they are required to do so? So as Michael kind of alluded to before, when we removed the minimum parking requirements, we still had to find a way for people to calculate how they were able to provide accessible parking. So we created this formula called effective parking spaces, which were based on the former minimums, and were kind of like the number of spaces that somebody would have been expected to provide for a development of that size previously, and then the calculation for how many accessible spaces they had to provide was based off of that number. So the way that the kind of formula worked, well, first of all, generally, medical offices and clinics have a higher rate for accessible parking spaces, and that's set at 10%. For everything that's not a medical office or clinic, it follows this rate table. This rate table kicks in for a residential zoned unit when it's providing 5 parking spaces or more for the residential use, or for anything else, so commercial, industrial, etc., when it's providing at least 1 parking space. So the rate table says that if your number of calculated effective parking spaces is less than 13, you have to provide 1 accessible parking space. If you have between 13 to 100 effective parking spaces based on your calculation, you have to provide 1 for every 25, or 4% of your parking spaces have to be designated accessible. If you have more than 100, then you need a base number of 5, plus 1 for every 50 effective parking spaces is accessible. So 5 plus 2%, essentially. Now, if a developer wants to install even more parking than whatever this effective parking calculation turns out to be, then they have to adjust the number of accessible parking spaces that they're provided based on the higher of two values. So if the effective calculation gives us 50 spaces, but they're providing 100, then they would need to apply these kind of formula to the 100 spaces and not the 50. So in order to access an accessible parking space, you need to have an accessible parking permit. Accessible parking permits are issued by the province of Ontario. And this graph is kind of illustrating what that change of parking permits in circulation has looked like across the last decade or so. So in 2012, there was about 80,000 accessible parking permits in circulation. And in 2022, which is the last full year for which we had data, that number was about 107,000, so a little bit more than a 25% increase. And in the kind of black line over top of the graph is the population growth of the city. So what we can see is that the permit growth is actually outpacing the growth of the entire population. So this is an important thing to consider as we move forward to kind of compare not just population growth, but also how that demand is increasing. And we'll talk a little bit about why that might be. To help contextualize the need for accessible parking permits a little bit more, here's some kind of population-based data which is somewhat relevant to that, to those values. So based on the Canadian Survey for Disability, about 20% of Canadians identified as having a disability, which limited them in their daily activities. In Toronto, 11% of people identify as having a mobility-related disability. A mobility-related disability is not the only reason why somebody might have an accessible parking permit. There's a whole list of conditions or statuses of people who might require an accessible parking permit. Low vision, for example, or other conditions that might limit a person's ability to walk for longer than a given distance would qualify them for a permit, either permanent or temporary or subject to change. In the Ontario Building Code, which also considers accessibility, 15% of units in the multi-unit housing have to be barrier-free. And currently, 4.5% of the population of Toronto holds an accessible parking permit based on those numbers that we received and that I was showing from the province just on the last slide. So one of the potential reasons why we're seeing that permit growth increase in the last little while is potentially related to the growth of the seniors population. So we live in a society that has an increasing growing number of seniors. For the purposes of this slide, is presented as people over 75 plus. It's not necessarily the fact that everybody who's over 65 plus is going to require an accessible parking permit, but there may be some kind of correlation there. When the province collects that data and provides it to us, we don't have any kind of identification related data or any of the reasons why somebody has an accessible permit, but we suspect that there is likely some kind of correlation between a generally aging population and the need for different accessibility accommodations. So as you can see, we expect that seniors population growth to increase significantly in the next couple of years. So as Michael was talking about this kind of idea of a policy window, we're hearing a lot about the concern for how we're going to accommodate that aging population when it comes to being able to provide enough accessible parking to meet people's needs. So similarly to the bike parking survey, we also launched an accessible parking survey. And the goal of the survey was to really assess the needs and experiences of users of accessible parking permits, to understand what kind of challenges they'd encountered, where they typically use their permits, what are the barriers to using those spaces, for example. We didn't get as many responses as the bicycle parking survey, but we still got a good number of responses. We had 86 or 87 people complete the survey. 69 of them actually made it to the end, which again was pretty good. We were a little bit actually surprised by who the people were that completed the survey. So people had to select what they identified with. And actually, the largest group represented in the survey was at 46%, were drivers or pedestrians who don't have an accessible parking permit, nor drive as somebody with an accessible parking permit. So that was kind of interesting. And they would have received slightly different questions on their survey compared to the people who identified as having experiences with accessible parking. And they had kind of a more comprehensive survey to really understand what kind of issues or experiences they've had. So to kind of briefly go through some of the main points, people were asked about both residential parking and non-residential parking. But one of the really interesting things that came out of the non-residential parking section of the survey was that people were asked to kind of select, not quite rate their experience, but identify how often they encountered barriers when using non-residential accessible parking across different types of parking space locations. So those that are 5 indicated here, on-street parking, green P lots, private lots like something you might find at a mall or a grocery store, healthcare facilities, and transit stations. And we asked them to describe 3 different metrics: the incidence of barriers that prevented parking, the frequency of not seeing any vacancy or any vacant parking spots, and finally, their ability to actually successfully park in a space, which requires both vacancy and no barriers that prevent use. So when we compared the responses across the different categories, on-street parking was kind of the least accessible of those options, followed by green P lots. Private lots and healthcare facilities were about equally ranked, and transit stations performed the best, but also had the least number of people who were accessing parking in transit stations. In terms of some of the greatest challenges and solutions, we asked people to respond kind of free-form to the questions. What are some of the greatest challenges that you encounter with accessible parking, and what are some potential solutions that the city should explore? And the responses that we got were somewhat related. I think the biggest challenge and potential solution were to increase the number of spaces that are available, because people have a really hard time finding accessible parking spaces that they can actually use. So the solution to that is to increase the number of spaces. Permit misuse and lack of enforcement is another really big issue. When it comes to permit misuse and enforcement, a lot of that probably comes from more the provincial side as well, because they're the ones who are issuing the permits, for example. Enforcement can happen on the city side in terms of how we allocate resources to make sure that the people parking in those spaces actually have or are holding a permit, for example. And another really big issue is just because you have a space doesn't mean that it's actually usable. So whether there are barriers preventing use, not having an access aisle, it being occupied partially by, perhaps shopping carts, which we've heard a lot of actually from the survey, and that's really unfortunate. So just being able to provide a space doesn't necessarily mean that it's usable. So how can we ensure that people are designing those spaces in a way that actually meets the needs of the people who use them? In terms of some of the directions that we've considered, based off of the feedback that we've received, the various consultations that we've done, and some of the data that I've shown, generally we'd like to increase the supply of accessible parking, and we're working on how to work that into the zoning bylaw. That also involves simplifying that formula from being based on these effective parking spaces to directly relating it to the number of dwelling units or ground floor area of a building, for example. As I mentioned before, making sure that those accessible parking spaces are distributed across different types of parking. So when you have multi-use buildings, making sure that each of those lot designations actually has accessible spaces for people to be able to use. As I mentioned previously, ensuring that those spaces are actually accessible. So what kind of guidelines can we provide to people to make sure that those spaces are usable? And finally, we think that it would be a really good idea to have some kind of public awareness campaign, making sure that people understand why it's important to keep those spaces free for the people who need them, and why it's so important and critical to their ability to access diverse and various places within the city. And one thing that actually saw a lot of success in Calgary is painting curbs for accessible parking spaces blue to provide an additional visual cue to discourage people from stopping or parking in those locations. And they actually saw in that pilot like a 65% reduction in the number of people who are stopping or parking in those spaces without displaying a permit. So something to potentially explore in the future. Okay, in terms of the timeline for all of this work, back in November we held the first round of public consultations, and this was both public meetings as well as the surveys that were being circulated around accessible and bicycle parking. From there, we have created some proposed draft changes, which you've heard about some of those, what the directions of those might look like, and that's still ongoing. And then in the first quarter of this year, we're hoping to have a second round of public consultation where we can share with people what those proposed changes look like and receive additional feedback. And then finally, reporting back to council and committee in the next quarter of this year. And on that, I will say thank you. If you have any comments, questions, feedback, you can either ask them now, or our contact information is up here if you want to shoot us an email or contact us.